The last step for your Skelly project is to copy the pose that you chose in the new viewpoint into your brown sketchbook. And you can see I printed out the kind of robo version of my skeleton and the kind of full imagery, the anatomically complete version of my skeleton. You can look at this on your tablet or you can look at these pictures on your laptop, whatever works for you. It's a little easier for me to have them physically in front of me, so that's what I've done. Before we start drawing, though, I want to review really quickly the kinds of joints that we're seeing in our Skelly figures, because that's one of the most interesting parts of this project. So the two most important joints that we're thinking about are hinge joints, which we see in the knee and the elbow, kind of a more complicated one in the knee with the patella, but it's essentially a hinge joint, meaning that it can move kind of like that, back and forth, but only in that direction. The other important joint that we're seeing is the ball and socket joint, which you see in the hip and also in the humerus and the ball of the scapula, the shoulder blade. So that kind of joint allows movement in multiple directions, kind of like that. That combination of those two joints in the limbs accounts for all the complexity of the poses, and it's really important just to recognize the difference. Okay, so starting with my drawing, I want to start like I always do, general to specific. I'm using just a HB pencil, nothing too fancy. And I'm going to start by looking at my robo-skeleton because I find that really helpful just to keep things simple. Going back and forth, I'm going to think about that egg shape of the rib cage, narrower at the top, wider at the bottom. The middle line of the rib cage is a little bit to the left. I can imagine the spine curving around. And since I just posed this figure, I remember that the spine is also kind of twisting. The pelvis is tilted. Not helpful to make the pelvis kind of a box to start with. Like we do in our proportion diagrams. Seeing the back of the pelvis, the arc of the pelvis coming like that, down and around the pubic symphysis, down here, back up, around. I think probably this needs to come a little lower since I can see that they're overlapping visually. Maybe this comes in a little bit. The joint of the hip. Femur coming down. As much as I'm trying to keep this drawing kind of open and loose, I'm also making some kind of comparisons. Where does the knee line up with the head? Now, visually, I can kind of compare that. It's also nice to have printed this out because I can literally draw on my printout. If you don't have access to a printer, that's okay. I'm not going to worry about the arms yet. I want to get this just the way I need it. I think I made the pelvis too big. A little smaller. Think about the curve of that body there. Shoulder blade sitting on top. I like the lighting in this view because it makes it really clear what's on a concavity, like the inside of the pelvis here, versus what's actually kind of catching the light. Same thing with this rib cage. If there's a side of the rib cage, a plane change, a front and a side, and those shapes are different. Because these are all form-defining features of the body, the muscles will follow these patterns. One of the reasons we start with the skeleton and then move to the muscles is that if you don't know where the skeleton is, you really can't place the rest of the body. So this is really essential practice. I'm drawing the kind of shoulder girdle, not any particular bone yet, but just how the kind of clavicles sit on top of the rib cage and curve around. Really beautiful way. All of the humerus. I'm going to continue in this really loose way, slowly building up form, letting one line kind of reference another, and then start to tighten it up. Okay, so I've worked on this for a bit and I've made a couple of changes. I noticed I kept making the head and the upper body kind of too big, so I had to keep like pushing that back. And I've just been drawing from the robo figure this whole time so far because it's so nice to see big shapes and to see things kind of simplified. I've also been starting to think about this not just as a copy, but as a drawing on its own. So what are the elements of drawing that can make this more spatially effective? One of the things I'm trying to do is kind of consistently shade things. So if something is, a left-facing plane, it has a certain kind of tone on it, maybe even hatching in the same direction. I can kind of go through and pull together all of those forms, and that helps make this more visually understandable. I'm also using a little bit of atmospheric perspective. So for example, this hand is much closer to me, the viewer, than this backhand. The image from the app doesn't use that, and that can be a little visually confusing. So when you're working on your drawings, remember you can actually do a little better than the printout. You can be a little bit more expressive. You can also think about would it be helpful to have a tone in the background? So for example, like this light on the shoulder blade is really kind of neat, but it's a little lost on my drawing. So I could decide to add kind of hatch through the background. Maybe I don't even have to have it everywhere, maybe just in some places. That might not only make the drawing clearer, it might make it kind of visually more interesting. Remember, it's not just a diagram, it's also a work of art. All right, and at this point, now that I've got my major forms figured out, I'm going to change to my anatomical skeleton view and start to add in some of the ribs, start to add in maybe the individual bones of the feet and the hands, a little information about the skull. But I'm like 90% of the way there. I don't want to go crazy. I don't want to make this difficult to look at. I just want to kind of clarify a few things. Right, the sternum is really nice to figure out. It's that nice midline of the body, rib cage. When it comes to a point. I don't even know if I'm going to draw each rib equally. I might even just create kind of like a cross contour pattern, and that's perfectly fine. I can let my eye fill in some of the detail, but it's nice to get the actual angle of the ribs. They drop down pretty dramatically before they turn and join the sternum. And the cartilage of the false ribs, up and down, turning around. All right, so we've got 1, 2, 3 ribs. I think I'll be real specific about those 3, and then let the others kind of hang. So shoulder blade there, I want that to be a little more specific. Cross contours the bones of the neck. That jawbone, I'm going to get that in there. And since she's tilted her head, the middle of the side of the skull is back a little bit. And her zygomatic bone, the cheekbone coming out, orbital bones. You can see just a little bit of the nose. Leave the teeth, leave them alone. I like that little bit of light on the back of the orbital bone, though. That's kind of cool. I'm finding these details. I'm thinking about what I need to know. The anterior superior iliac spine, those are important. Kind of emphasizing those with my pencil. Pubic symphysis, that's important. And as I'm drawing, I'm kind of reciting in my head some of these anatomical terms, like the great trochanter, right? That bump where you connect. That's the bump that you can kind of feel on the side of your hip. The acetabulum, connection of the pelvis to the hip, to the femur, ischium, that whole sit bones, the bottom of the pelvis. You can see how much easier it is to find these things once you've got the general forms. The way that the femur kind of arches forward. The tibial tuberosity, where all the tendons of the patella connect. Thing like these bones, they're more of a pattern than they are individual forms. So I can maybe pick out the big toe, which is important. And spaces in between tarsals. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. Picking out the lights. Thinking about, does this have the kind of grace in the movement that I was excited about at the beginning when I picked out this pose? Using my eraser to kind of pick out Got some of these kind of flowing lines again. And I think we'll call it.